Diane's fingers laced through mine before I even registered her walking toward me, and the words left her mouth like she'd rehearsed them 100 times in the mirror. Everyone, this is my boyfriend. I want you to understand something about Diane Foster. For 18 months, this woman had made it her personal mission to make my life at Callahan Marketing a slow-motion disaster. She once rescheduled a client meeting behind my back just to watch me walk into an empty conference room looking like an idiot. She corrected my grammar in shared documents just to leave a paper trail of my inadequacy. We didn't nod at each other in the break room. We calculated. So when she showed up at my apartment that morning, uninvited, insisting I come to her family's 4th of July barbecue because she needed a favor, I should have slammed the door. Instead, curiosity got the better of me, the same curiosity that gets men killed in horror movies. Now I stood in her parents' backyard in Millbrook, surrounded by string lights, a cooler the size of a bathtub, and roughly 20 strangers who all shared her sharp jawline. And she had just introduced me as the man she was apparently sleeping with. My name is Caleb Ross. I'm 29, and in that moment, I felt every muscle in my body forget how to function. Diane's hand was warm and steady in mine, which was somehow worse than if it had been shaking. This wasn't panic. This was strategy. Her mother, a woman with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up into it, actually gasped and pressed a hand to her chest like she'd won something. Finally, her mother said, looking at me like I was a rare bird that had landed in her yard. Diane never brings anyone home. We were starting to think you were a myth, honey. Diane laughed, this bright, easy laugh I had never once heard in the office, and squeezed my hand tighter. A silent warning, a plea, maybe both. Her grip said play along, louder than any words could have. An older man, broad-shouldered and holding a spatula like a weapon of authority, walked over and clapped me on the back hard enough to knock the air out of me. "So you're the guy," he said, grinning. "I'm Frank, Diane's dad. About time she brought somebody who could handle her." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. What was I supposed to say? "Actually, sir, your daughter and I once spent 45 minutes arguing over a font in a PowerPoint presentation. That she'd told the entire marketing team I had the creative instincts of a filing cabinet. That 2 hours ago, the extent of our relationship was mutual professional loathing." Diane must have felt me stiffen, because she leaned in close, her mouth near my ear, close enough that anyone watching would assume something intimate was being whispered. What she actually said was, "Please, I will explain everything. Just don't blow this up in front of my entire family." Her eyes weren't cold like they were in the office. They were desperate, glassy at the edges. The eyes of someone standing on a ledge they built themselves and just realized was higher than they thought. Somewhere behind us, someone cranked up country music from a portable speaker, and a kid ran past us waving a sparkler despite it still being broad daylight. Frank was already yelling for someone to grab me a beer. Diane's mother was already asking when we started dating, and I stood there, hand still locked in my rival's hand, absolutely no idea what I had just agreed to. "My name is Ryan Cole. I'm 29, and up until that 4th of July, the only thing I felt for Diane Foster was a very specific, very professional kind of hatred, the kind you build one quarterly report at a time. We worked at Halvard Marketing, a mid-sized agency that liked to pretend it was a family while ranking everyone against everyone else on a whiteboard nobody admitted existed. Diane ran the Chandler account. I ran the Meridian account. Both accounts hated sharing budget, which meant Diane and I hated sharing anything. She was 41, sharp as a paper cut, and she had this habit of saying, "just so we're aligned," right before she completely undercut you in a meeting. The rivalry started small. A stolen client lunch reservation, a presentation slot she accidentally moved up so mine looked rushed by comparison. Then it escalated the way these things always do, quietly, professionally, with a smile on top. She once corrected my numbers in front of the regional director, not because she was wrong to, but because of how she did it, like she'd been waiting all week for the chance. I retaliated, obviously. I wasn't proud of it, but I wasn't going to just stand there either. I found ways to make her look disorganized without technically lying. I let silences hang in meetings when she needed backup. We never yelled, never fought outright. We were far too polished for that. It was all undertones and eyebrow raises. The kind of war fought entirely in email tone. For an entire year, that was our relationship. Two people circling the same promotion, the same clients, the same conference room, refusing to give an inch. Coworkers started calling us the rival desks, like we were some kind of sitcom. Someone even ran a betting pool on who'd crack first. Nobody bet on this. The truth is, I respected her more than I wanted to. She was better than me at reading a room, better at closing, better at recovering when a pitch went sideways. That respect made the rivalry worse, not better. Because losing to someone mediocre stings for a day. Losing to someone genuinely good stays with you. 3 days before the barbecue, she stopped by my desk, which she never did. No email trail, no witnesses. Just her leaning against the divider like she owned it. "I need a favor," she said. Like the words physically cost her something, I actually laughed. "You need a favor from me. Don't make this weirder than it already is." She crossed her arms. "Family thing. 4th of July. I need someone to come with me." I asked why, obviously, because nothing about that sentence made sense coming from her. She just said, "It's complicated," and walked away before I could push further, leaving me standing there wondering what kind of complicated required borrowing your office rival for a holiday weekend. I said yes, not because I liked her, because curiosity is a hell of a drug, and because some small competitive part of me wanted to see what made Diane Foster, of all people, ask for help. I told myself it was reconnaissance. Information for the next fiscal quarter. I did not tell myself it might mean standing in her parents' backyard, sun overhead, her hands suddenly wrapped around mine, while an entire family I'd never met turned to look at us like we were the main event, which is exactly where I found myself now. Still frozen, still smiling on reflex, replaying that conversation from 3 days earlier, and realizing I had missed something important. She never once said the word date. 3 days earlier, I did not know any of this was coming. What I knew was that Diane Foster had just spent 40 minutes dismantling my proposal in front of the entire regional team, using the kind of calm, surgical precision that made you thank her for the criticism before you realized how deep the cut went. When the meeting ended, people filed out fast, the way they always did after one of our clashes, like they didn't want to be caught in the blast radius if round 2 started in the hallway. I was gathering my laptop, still replaying her line about my numbers being optimistic in the way fiction is optimistic, when her hand landed flat on the conference table in front of me. "Walk with me," she said. Not a question. Diane rarely asked questions when a statement would do. We ended up in the stairwell, the one nobody used because the elevator was faster, which apparently made it the only private space in a building full of glass walls. She crossed her arms and studied me for a second too long, like she was deciding whether I was worth the trouble of what she was about to say. "I need a favor," she said finally, and I almost laughed, because in a year of trading barbed comments and meetings, Diane had never once used the word need in my presence. "I'm listening," I said, mostly out of curiosity, partly because turning down a woman who could still torch my quarterly review seemed unwise. "My family has this thing about the 4th of July, she said. "A whole production, extended relatives, my mother interrogating my life choices, my aunt bringing up my divorce like it's a recurring segment on the evening news. Every year it's the same question. When am I finally going to bring someone home? And you want me to fix that how, exactly? I want you to be that someone," she said, flat, like she was assigning me a task on a shared spreadsheet. "One weekend, you play the boyfriend, my family stops circling, and everyone goes back to their normal lives afterward." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that didn't come. "You want me to pretend to be your boyfriend for your family's holiday party. I want you to survive one barbecue," she corrected. "In exchange, I make sure the Whitmore account lands on your desk instead of mine next quarter. You've been chasing that client for months. I can make it happen with one conversation." That account was the kind of win that reshaped a career, the kind people mentioned in promotion meetings years later. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked why. Out of everyone in that office, she picked the man who spent the last year trying to outmaneuver her in every meeting we shared. Instead, I heard myself say, "Define pretend. Hold my hand when it's expected. Laugh at my father's terrible jokes. Don't correct anything I say about you, no matter how strange it sounds." She said it like she was reading from a manual she'd already written in her head, And if I say no, then I find someone else, and you spend next quarter wondering what could have been." She almost smiled when she said it, the same expression she wore right before she picked apart my presentations. I told myself I was doing it for the account. That was the version of the story I repeated on the drive to her parents' house 3 days later, right up until her fingers wrapped around mine on that sunlit lawn and her mother's face lit up like Christmas had arrived early. The Foster property wasn't a backyard. It was an estate that happened to have a barbecue on it. Rolling grass stretched toward a lake with a dock and 2 kayaks tied up like they were props in a lifestyle commercial. String lights looped between oak trees, older than the company I worked for, and somewhere a country song was playing off a speaker system that probably cost more than my car. I had expected a modest cookout. Instead, I felt like I'd walked onto the set of a 4th of July advertisement, and I was the confused extra who forgot his line. Diane's mother, Carol, hugged me before I even got my hand fully extended, pulling me in like we'd known each other for years instead of 40 seconds. "Diane never brings anyone home," she said, holding my shoulders and studying my face like she was checking for authenticity. "You must be special." I caught Diane's eyes over her mother's shoulder. There was a flicker there, something close to panic, quickly buried under a practiced smile. "He's something, all right," she said, looping her arm through mine like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Her father, Gerald, was next. A tall man with a firm handshake and the kind of stare that made me feel like I was being evaluated for a loan. "So you're the one keeping her at the office till 9 every night," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't friendly either. "She's the one keeping me there, sir," I said before I could stop myself. Diane's grip on my arm tightened, a warning disguised as affection, but her father laughed, actually laughed, and clapped me on the back like I'd passed some invisible test. Then came the siblings, a younger brother named Kyle, who immediately asked if I played cornhole, and an older sister, Renee, who looked at me the way Diane looked at underperforming spreadsheets. "So how'd you two meet?" Renee asked, arms crossed, clearly unconvinced. "Work," I said. "Rivals," Diane added quickly, who realized the tension wasn't just professional. She said it smoothly, like she'd rehearsed it in the car, and maybe she had, but the way her cheeks colored slightly afterward told me some part of that sentence embarrassed her more than she expected. 2 aunts appeared out of nowhere, the kind of women who could smell a lie the way sharks smell blood. Aunt Pam and Aunt Louise flanked me within minutes, firing questions in tandem. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do? Did I want children someday? I answered on instinct, inventing small, harmless details, watching Diane nod along like she already knew the answers, filling gaps I hadn't even realized I'd left open. What surprised me wasn't the interrogation. It was Diane. Every time one of her relatives got too sharp, too pointed, she'd lean into me slightly, resting a hand on my chest, or laughing at something I said like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all year. At the office, her laugh was a weapon, short and cutting. Here, it was warmer, unguarded, like she'd left half of herself in the parking lot. At one point, while her mother pulled her into the kitchen to check on the potato salad, Diane turned back and mouthed the words, "Thank you," so quietly I almost missed it. It wasn't performance, it was real, and it unsettled me more than any part of the ruse had so far. Kyle handed me a beer and nodded toward the lake. "Dad's doing the fireworks show later. Diane used to help him set them up when she was a kid." He grinned. "She was terrified of the loud ones." I filed that away, another crack in the version of her I thought I knew, another reason this weekend was going to be far more complicated than a simple trade of favors. The burgers were still on the grill when the first crack appeared, and it came in the form of a black Jeep pulling up the gravel driveway a little too fast. Diane's mother saw it before anyone else did, and I watched her face change from summer-relaxed to carefully composed in about 2 seconds flat, which told me whoever was in that Jeep mattered. "Oh, good," she said, in a voice that suggested the opposite. "Trevor's..." Diane's hand found mine on the picnic table, gripping harder than the moment required. "Ex-boyfriend," she muttered under her breath. 3 years. "Family still invites him because my dad likes his boat." Trevor turned out to be exactly the kind of man you'd expect a family to keep around out of habit rather than affection. Tall, sunburned, wearing a fishing shirt like a costume. He hugged Diane's father a beat too long, complimented her mother's potato salad, and then found us at the table with the kind of smile that had clearly been rehearsed on the drive over. "So this is the boyfriend," he said, extending a hand that felt like it wanted to break mine. "Diane doesn't usually bring people around." "First time for everything," I said, matching his grip. Diane leaned into my shoulder, an easy, practiced motion that still managed to send a small jolt through me, and said, "He's not intimidated by boats, Trevor." That's new for me, too. It got a laugh from the table, but Trevor's eyes lingered a second too long, cataloging, comparing, and I understood we'd just become a performance for an audience of one who actually had something to lose. The game started not long after. Cornhole and horseshoes scattered across the lawn, and that's when Diane's younger sister Maddie sidled up next to me while Diane was refilling drinks. Maddie had the same sharp eyes as her sister, minus a decade of corporate polish. "You two don't fight like people who've been together 6 months," she said, tossing a beanbag without looking at the board. "We're private people," I said. "No," she said, "I mean you don't fight at all. Diane fights with everyone. She fought with our cousin over a Scrabble word for 20 minutes at Thanksgiving." She finally looked at me. "She's never once raised her voice at you today." I didn't have an answer for that, because she wasn't wrong, and I filed it next to the fireworks story Kyle had given me earlier, another piece of a puzzle I hadn't agreed to solve. Diane rescued me a few minutes later, tugging me toward the dock under the pretense of showing me the sunset, and once we were out of earshot, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since Trevor's Jeep appeared. "Thank you," she said, "for not making a scene. Your family's very observant. They're worse than the office," she said, almost laughing. Which is saying something. The water turned orange and pink behind her, and for a second neither of us said anything, the noise of the party fading into something distant. She looked at me the way she never had at work, without armor, and before I fully understood what was happening, she leaned in and kissed me. Quick and soft, her hand curling into my shirt like she needed something to hold on to. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, and when she pulled back her eyes were wide, like she'd surprised herself as much as she'd surprised me. "That was for Trevor," she said quickly. "He's watching from the porch," but her hand hadn't let go of my shirt yet, and I was starting to wonder if that was really the reason at all. I didn't get the chance to ask her what she meant, because that's when Trevor decided to stop watching from the porch and start walking toward us, beer in hand, jaw set like a man who'd rehearsed this moment in the bathroom mirror. "Diane," he said, loud enough that a few cousins turned their heads. "Can we talk? Alone?" She stepped in front of me, not behind, and I noticed that detail even in the middle of the chaos. "Whatever you want to say, you can say in front of him." Trevor laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. "In front of your boyfriend?" "Sure. Let's do that." Then he looked at me, really looked, the way you look at something you're trying to find the seams on. "You two have been dating, what, 3 months? Because I talked to your mom on the phone in April, and she didn't mention him once." The air went thin. Diane's hand found my shirt again, tighter this time, and I felt her whole body go rigid beside me. Somewhere behind us, a firework cracked open, gold sparks raining down over the lake, and half the family let out an appreciative "ooh," like the world wasn't currently falling apart 6 feet away from the dessert table. "Trevor, this isn't the time," Diane said, but her voice had lost its edge. "No, actually, I think it's exactly the time." He turned to the porch, to her parents, to the aunts clutching sparklers. "Ask him where they met. Go on. Ask him what her favorite color is. Ask him anything real." Nobody asked, but the silence did the asking for them, and I felt every eye on the lawn shift toward me like I was suddenly standing on a stage I never auditioned for. I could have kept lying. It would have been easy, another few sentences and the moment would pass, swallowed up by the next explosion of color overhead. But Diane's hand was shaking against my chest, and something about that undid me more than Trevor's smugness ever could. "He's right," I said. "We're not dating. We work together." She asked me to come, so her family would back off for one weekend, and I agreed because it seemed simple. I looked at Diane. I didn't think it would feel like this. Her mother's face didn't crumble the way I expected. She just nodded slowly, like she'd suspected it since the driveway. Trevor looked almost disappointed that the fight was over before it started, and he wandered off toward the cooler, like he'd lost interest now that he'd won. Diane pulled me away from the crowd, past the tent full of folding chairs, down toward the dark edge of the yard where the fireworks turned the water silver and gold in bursts. "I'm sorry," she said, arms crossed like she was holding herself together. "I should never have put you in the middle of that." "Why me?" I asked. "Out of everyone you could have asked, why the guy who fights you over every accounted work?" She was quiet for a second, watching the sky instead of me. "Because you're the only person who's never once tried to be nice to me for the wrong reasons. Everyone else wants something from me, Michael. You just wanted to win." She finally turned, and somewhere along the way I stopped wanting to beat you and started wanting you to stay. The next firework lit her face, gold, and for the first time all weekend, I didn't know if I was still playing a part. I didn't get the chance to answer her, because that's when the porch light flicked on behind us, flooding the yard in white, and a voice I hadn't heard all weekend cut through the noise of the crowd. "Diane, is that Michael Reyes?" I turned to see a man in his early 40s walking down the porch steps, still in a wrinkled dress shirt like he'd come straight from an airport. He had Diane's same sharp jaw, the same way of sizing up a room before entering it. Diane went rigid beside me. "That's my brother," she muttered under her breath. "Elliot. He wasn't supposed to be here until tomorrow." Elliot reached us before I could process the panic in her voice. He looked at me, then at Diane, then back at me with an expression I recognized instantly because I'd worn it myself in boardrooms. The look of a man doing rapid math. "Michael Reyes from Hartwell Logistics," he said. "The guy who beat out Diane's team for the Denver account last spring?" The fireworks kept popping overhead, but the air around us had gone very still. Diane's mother, drawn by the sound of Elliot's voice, appeared at the edge of the porch with a tray of lemon bars still in her hands, and I watched her face shift as she registered the tension. "You two know each other from work?" Elliot asked, looking between us like he caught the punchline to a joke nobody else was in on. "Diane, isn't this the same Michael you spent an entire Thanksgiving complaining about? You called him, what was it, insufferably smug with a spreadsheet?" A few relatives nearby laughed, but it was the nervous kind of laugh, the kind that comes right before someone asks a question nobody wants answered. Diane's father set down his drink, and Carol, who'd been suspicious of me since the moment I arrived, suddenly looked very interested in leaning closer. "Elliot," Diane said, voice tight. "That's not—" "No, I remember," Elliot pressed, grinning now like he thought he was being helpful. "You said if you ever had to work with him again you'd request a transfer. And now he's your boyfriend?" He laughed once, short and disbelieving. When exactly did that turnaround happen? I felt every set of eyes in the yard shift toward us, waiting. Diane's mother's tray dipped slightly in her hands. Somewhere behind us, the fireworks show hit its finale, a rapid string of golden red bursts lighting up the whole property. But nobody was watching the sky anymore. I opened my mouth, not entirely sure what was about to come out of it, some mixture of instinct and self-preservation kicking in. But before I could speak, Diane stepped forward, closer to her brother, closer to the small crowd that had gathered without any of us noticing. "You want the truth?" she said, and something in her tone made my stomach drop, because I couldn't tell if she meant the truth about the rivalry, or the truth about tonight, or something else entirely that she'd been circling for the last 20 minutes on that dark stretch of lawn. "Fine, let's do this now." Her mother set the tray down slowly on the porch railing. Elliot's smile faded into confusion, and Diane turned to face her entire family, the fireworks finale still crackling behind her, her hand finding mine again, not gripping it the way she had at the start of the night, but holding it like she wasn't sure whether she was about to lose it. 3 months. That's how long it's been since that lawn, since that confession, since her mother stood there with a tray of half-eaten pie and watched her daughter tell the truth for the first time in front of people who thought they already knew her. Diane didn't get fired for the fake boyfriend stunt, obviously. Nobody at the office even knows. What they do know is that the woman who used to send passive-aggressive emails with, "per my last message," now leaves coffee on my desk without being asked. And somehow that's more suspicious to our coworkers than anything else could have been. Frank from accounting asked me last week if we were up to something. I told him we were just colleagues who occasionally happened to eat lunch together. He didn't believe me, he shouldn't. I don't believe me either. Here's what nobody tells you about turning a rivalry into something real. The competitive edge doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. We still argue over campaign strategy like our lives depend on it. She still thinks my instincts are reckless, and I still think her caution costs us opportunities. But now when we fight about it, we end up at her apartment afterward still arguing, except somewhere between the second glass of wine and the takeout containers, the fight turns into something softer. She still wins most of the arguments. I've made peace with that. Her family, by the way, has fully adopted me. Elliot, the ex who showed up uninvited that night trying to stir up chaos, apparently sends her a birthday text every year out of habit, and this year Diane forwarded it to me with the caption, "Still not you." Her mother calls me every other Sunday now, not to check on Diane, but to ask if I'm eating properly, like I'm the one who needs saving. Her sister still hasn't fully forgiven herself for almost blowing our cover that weekend, and she brings it up constantly, usually right before asking when we're making things official. We haven't rushed that part. After everything that 4th of July forced out into the open, we agreed we didn't want to build this on urgency. We wanted to build it slow, on purpose, the opposite of how it started. So we've spent these months learning each other outside of boardrooms and backyard interrogations. Learning that she hates mornings, that she cries at commercials but never at movies, that underneath every sharp comment she's ever made at me in a meeting was someone testing whether I'd actually push back or just fold. I used to think our rivalry was about proving who was better. Turns out it was about finding someone who wouldn't let either of us get away with being anything less than our best selves. That's a strange thing to discover through a lie, but I'm not complaining about how we got here. Last week she told me something I haven't stopped thinking about. She said the scariest part of that whole weekend wasn't the fireworks, and it wasn't her family finding out. It was realizing halfway through pretending that she didn't want to stop. Neither did I. So if you've ever had a work rival who made your blood boil in ways you couldn't quite explain, I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. The messier, the better. And if you liked watching two stubborn people ruin their own lie by falling into it, stick around. Because this channel is full of stories exactly like this one. Subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Trust me, it's worth it.